Good morning, all, or good evening, all, from whatever part of the world you're joining. It is absolutely a pleasure to have you once again for the India Dialogue Conversation. As you know, the India Dialogue Conversations is a joint effort between USADMC at Stanford and Institute for Competitiveness. So the co-conspirators for this program are Richard Asher and I, who we have been collaborating on this program for over 2 years now. And we've had some very exciting speakers over the course of a period of 2 years. But today we have a special guest, Arun. In fact, Arun is Professor of Global Security and Technology at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden. Incidentally, a lawyer by profession, and for some odd reason, rather than practicing, he got into being a faculty, so which is a very unique situation. But has done some amazing work across the board. In fact, he wrote a book on Midnight Machine, which has been on the Bloomberg's best books of 2020 as well. Co-edited a number of books. He's published a lot. So absolutely an accomplished academic. So Arun, thanks a lot for joining us today for this conversation. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you with us.
The pleasure is mine. Thanks, Amit, and thanks, Richard, for having me.
Thank you. So Arun, as you know, like we were wanting to discuss bits about DPI today. That's been something very exciting in India that has happened. Everybody across the globe has been talking about it. But from your point of view, as you've done a lot of academic work in this area, what do you think has been the most notable success of the DPI journey, and what are the kind of setbacks that we have faced across the board?
Just for people who may not have seen all the material, we're talking about digital public infrastructure. And if I could also ask you to kind of give a quick definition of just what we mean by DPI, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Amit, and thanks, Richard, again for having me at the seminar. So to begin with, perhaps the most difficult question of all, which is what is the definition of digital public infrastructure? I mean, I have to be upfront and say I do not have a definition that is normatively or even practically sound. All that I can say about DPI in the truest sense of the term is that the way in which India has been deploying this infrastructure is that, one, it has a digital component. And it's important to sort of emphasize this, that and we'll, of course, get into this discussion at a later stage as well. You have infrastructure that is digital in its most comprehensive form. It is primarily dealing with digital artifacts, but you can also, as India is developing now, digitally enabled infrastructure, which has a very substantial interaction with, the offline world, as it were, especially in sectors like transport and health, as we are now seeing. So that's the digital part of it. But perhaps the most important element of all of this is the public component of DPI. And I think, as with many countries that are trying to develop such infrastructure in their respective economies, India is also trying to figure out what exactly constitutes public infrastructure. What is the public in DPI? Does it mean that the infrastructure is developed by the state and regulated by the state? Is it owned by the state? Or is it infrastructure, to move away from that spectrum, is developed partly by the state, but also in conjunction with private developers or private or multi-stakeholder standard-setting bodies? Or even moving further from that spectrum, is it simply infrastructure that serves a public use, whether or not it is developed by the state or by private developers? I think we are at a stage where we're probably narrowing down on the middle definition, where some infrastructure has clearly been developed by the state and is in fact actively managed by, for lack of a better term, a bureaucracy that is entirely within the remit of the state. But we are also seeing digital public infrastructure in India that is being developed by multi-stakeholder institutions, certainly private institutions, and then is being handed over to the state, where we are not exactly clear on what the parameters of regulation are, but at least the imprimatur of the state in somehow managing this infrastructure is lending the publicness to it. So the short answer to your question is that there is no acceptable definition of DPI, but there are many definitions at play here. And as is rightly the case, these definitions are very much on a moving spectrum, partly responding to the realities of developing this infrastructure on the ground. So that's a little bit about the definitional aspects, which also ties in to the question that Amit raised. Where are we in India's DPI journey? And fortuitously, there is today a discussion that's happening at the UN about, I think, the first ever high-level forum on digital public infrastructure. So clearly, this is a topic that is of considerable interest to countries, both from the global north, but also from developing countries, the global south, as it were. I think in terms of India's trajectory, I think it would be perhaps to sort of take some steps back. It would be, I think, an appropriate way to characterize India's journey on DPIs as a moving goalpost. And I think to be sort of honest about this journey. The reason why India began developing digital public infrastructure in 2008, 2009, when you really see the development and the deployment at scale of the biometric ID platform that is today known as Aadhaar, the reasons for developing this infrastructure is arguably different, or at least, yes, different from what it is today. And the reason at that time was primarily that India needed digital public infrastructure like Aadhaar for primarily efficiency at the last mile. A widespread acknowledgement of the reality that in the 70-odd years since India had won independence, there was a problem in the government's attempts to reach the citizen at her last mile, at the household level. And the biometric ID platform was responding to that reality. Cut to, fast forward to 15 years or so today, since the development of that sort of national biometric ID platform. I think the reason why India today develops digital public infrastructure is, of course, very much governance at the last mile, to prevent leakages at the last mile, to improve governance. All those efficiency arguments associated with governance still hold very true. But one of the additional important reasons why India today develops digital public infrastructure is to ensure that there are no winner-take-all markets in the digital economy. I think what India is also trying to do, what I'm trying to say is that what India is also trying to do today with DPR is to ensure that you do not have these formulaic big tech companies that come in and monopolize every aspect of the supply chain in the digital economy. I think it sort of is incredulous that a company like Apple makes a 40% profit margin on every iPhone device, every iPhone that is sold in the market today. That number may have grown in the last couple of years since the statistic came out. So I think one of the reasons why DPI is being developed today in India, which includes the sort of panoply of second generation DPI that deals with health, transport, digital commerce, and the last one being especially significant, is to ensure that you do not have markets which are prone to natural monopolies. And once a company or a corporation has established a monopolistic position in that market, it's very difficult to unseat them. And in fact, the nature of the market, as we have seen, at least with the examples of these big tech companies, is that they move to other sectors associated with the supply chain, ranging from submarine cables to the handheld device of the user, and they are for reasons of we call them markets of scale, economies of scale. However you might want to justify them, the fact is then that these companies dominate every aspect of the supply chain, which makes it very difficult for other entrants, which is of course key to innovation and disruption and all the other things that we associate with a fair and competitive digital economy. So I think those are the two reasons that bookend the development of the digital public infrastructure journey in India. To Amit's question, what are the successes and the failures? I think the success is that there has been widespread adoption of this public infrastructure. There is no doubt that the legitimacy conferred on DPI by the state, and opinions are still divided today as to whether the mandatory adoption of some of this DPI is ultimately for the consumer's benefit. What are the costs and trade-offs associated with scaling up with the as I said, the imprimatur of the state. That has today, I think I can say in a very qualified way, if the government nudged citizens to adopt the DPI in the early stages of the building of such infrastructure, today there is definitely popular appeal that such an infrastructure enjoys. And this is perhaps the most remarkable success story of this infrastructure is the unified payments interface, which is today beating the established giants in this space hollow, not just in terms of the sheer number of transactions that happens through this digital payment gateway in India, but also by volume. Now, a few years ago, you could not say that the volume of money that is exchanged that is transferred through UPI is in comparison to that of, say, MasterCard or Visa. But today we are at the stage where that too is happening. And UPI has no forced adoption, or there's nothing that the state is beyond incentives and certain market practices, of course, whose merits or demerits can be evaluated. This growth of UPI, this monumental growth of UPI, is largely driven by the people. So we are seeing an evolution of DPI's legitimacy in India in some respects, where there has been and there continues to be an active debate, especially within civil society constituents, as to what is a good way to ensure the adoption of such public infrastructure. How much should the state lean into it? What is the consequence of the state trying to regulate this and trying to co-opt the digital public infrastructure, including for its own, potentially nefarious purposes like surveillance? Then there has been an active dialogue that is happening in the legal circles, which culminated, as you perhaps know, in the Supreme Court of India's judgment in 2018 on the right to privacy. The debate only began with that Supreme Court judgment, but there is also similarly a popular uptake of DPI that is happening in other sectors as well. So I think these twin dialogues of what does it mean for this to be public in the sense that it's owned by the state and used for the state for whatever purposes that the government might deem fit, as opposed to what is the popular claim and legitimacy of some of this infrastructure. I think both of these debates are going ahead, and as with any topic in India, as you can imagine, these debates are never easily resolved. But I think what you are seeing, certain trends are certainly visible and hopefully irreversible. One of them, and if I can just take maybe just a minute to say that, and then sort of throw the ball back into your court. One is the role of the private sector. I think what we are seeing definitely today is that the private sector in India is wanting to be an active participant in the development of digital public infrastructure. The state, to its credit, both at the national and the state levels, has ceded some space to private actors to come in and help in the deployment of digital public infrastructure. Some very few at the inception and the development stage, but many more at the deployment at scale stage, and even more, I would say, at the policy and regulation stage. In some cases, there is a consultation policy, a multi-stakeholder policy of consultations that is still finding its feet with regard to the policy and governance frameworks for this DPI. But there are also governance frameworks that are multi-stakeholder in character, where the regulator or the state institution is sitting alongside, most notably the example of the National Payments Corporation of India, where the Reserve Bank, the central bank, is sitting alongside private banks to determine what the regulatory parameters of the unified payment interface and other financial products that flow from the use of this digital public infrastructure should be. That's one hopefully irreversible trend for me. Second, I think there is much more debate today on aspects of privacy and surveillance associated with digital public infrastructure. This is a long and difficult conversation that's not going to be resolved anytime soon. I think it was more visible and certainly more voluble during the days of Aadhaar, given that the state was the first and perhaps the only actor involved in the deployment at scale of that particular digital public infrastructure. But this is more nuanced today, given the entry of private actors. What does it mean for private actors to design and implement products that are reliant on DPI, but may nevertheless be continuing to collect sensitive personal information. This is a debate that's ongoing at this stage. So the terms of debate regarding privacy and surveillance has also shifted. I think the Indian public and especially civil society are good at holding the government's feet to the fire, and certainly now with the widespread adoption of DPI, better at holding private actors that rely on such infrastructure accountable in terms of privacy violations or even monopolistic or anti-competitive practices in the market. So those are two trends that I would say perhaps look healthy in the long run.
Amit,
I think you're on mute.
Arun, you lay the ground very well out here. But just a very curious question. When you said ensure that there is nothing like winner-take-all markets in the digital space, like what is the evidence here? Because that becomes a very important aspect, because this becomes at the heart of the way the capitalistic system works or functions as well.
Right. And the honest answer, it's a great question, Amit, and the honest answer is that the evidence is mixed. This is one of the goals of DPI today in India, but to what extent has it been possible for the Indian digital economy to ensure that the market is still open to disruption and innovative practices? I think the jury is still out on this. The best example again is UPI, and it's easy to sort of keep going back to UPI because we've seen this digital public infrastructure and the ecosystem associated with this interface mature in such a short period of time that it's easy for us to understand what went right and what went wrong with the adoption of UPI. And what clearly went wrong with UPI, there are a couple of things that went wrong, but to the question that you raised, it's very clear that the leaders of the market that relied on UPI and sought to engage the young Indian digital user through UPI for their various products is still very much Google, Amazon, and the big players. And the reasons for this may have to do with the fact that there was no sustainable model of revenue generation through the use of UPI, something that is now being seen in India with the debate on what is called the merchant discount rate, the use of MDR in a way that private actors that actually develop this platform, banks that develop this platform actually have a sustainable source of revenue from its use. And more importantly, the fact that companies that have a built-in product relating to, for example, Google Play or Amazon, the Amazon Marketplace, already have the resources to integrate this digital public infrastructure into their existing platforms at a fraction of the cost as to the other Indian or foreign players that want to enter this ecosystem. And ultimately, this is nothing but a design game. The Indian user is constantly looking for user interfaces and choices that are present in the digital economy that allow for a seamless, in the context that we are discussing, seamless payment, but seamless transferring of, for example, health information that ultimately, or seamless availability of transport options, you name it, ultimately provides her or him a sort of the most wide-ranging options that are ultimately tailored to their experience. And the reality is that Google or Amazon are just very good at providing, those interface-driven options that can seamlessly integrate digital public infrastructure into their existing solutions. So this is a challenge that perhaps regulators or corporations that were entering the market could not immediately foresee. So I think the Indian regulator, the NPCI in this space, tried to come up with certain policy options that would effectively target the market leaders, but they are ultimately not sustainable in the long run. There is some way in which the Indian market needs to decide how can digital public infrastructure be sustainably a source of revenue for those actors who are involved in the design and development of products that build on DPI, and two, if you do have monopolistic markets emerging in either finance or health or transport or whatever sector DPIs are being implemented in, how are you going to regulate them? How are you going to not only with regard to the monopolistic practices, how are you going to regulate questions of privacy and surveillance and use of consumer data that come with monopolistic markets? And today, it is today an article of faith that anti-competitive practices lead to a degradation of privacy. Till a few years ago, the connection between them seemed somewhat tenuous. Today, we know that there is, in fact, an established connection, as many scholars have pointed out. This question is not going to be answered by DPI governance alone. It is going to be answered by whether India has a good privacy governing framework in place. And the answer to that is no. There has been a series of debates on data protection and cybersecurity legislation in India, but this conversation seems to be stretching on for more time than it should. Somewhat, almost seeming like Indian regulators are waiting for a perfect legislation that is bound to be the enemy of the good, as it were, right? So I think some of those regulatory choices are not going to be made in DPI related issues alone, but have to do with how the market regulates behavior between consumers and market products. And there, the weaknesses of implementing, deploying DPI at scale have been exposed, because you don't have the ground game to govern larger issues such as privacy and antitrust.
To some extent, this is a universal problem. And I think that, as an outsider, when I first heard about Aadhaar, I was absolutely blown away that you could develop a biometric identification system that's using pretty advanced technology and spread it through a billion-person population within just a few years. And now, as new services are rolling out, like the Unified Payment Interface and UPI, and other things, it is not surprising that these big problems like privacy are coming to the front, as well as they haven't all been solved yet. I'm really curious how you think it was that India was able to be successful in developing this scale of digital public infrastructure, and especially in regard to the regulations, how privacy is going to be dealt with. Are there lessons that can be transmitted to other places?
Thanks, Richard. I think, as I mentioned, success is both owed to the fact that, I think some of these people who are involved in the conversations around developing DPI often like to characterize what it means to implement such infrastructure in high trust societies versus low trust societies, and in characteristic low trust society where the ordinary Indian society still believes in the legitimacy of the state over players in the market. The fact that the government here was telling you to please consider the adoption of this infrastructure, in some cases mandating it by law, certainly provided the trigger movement that was needed for DPI to succeed in the early years. But then, as we discussed, there's clearly certain products like UPI that have been, that were meeting a long-standing demand of the market in sectors such as finance. I think the thinking now to address some of the questions that you raised with respect to privacy and also to add anti-competitive practices to that, the thinking now with respect to DPI in India is that rather than trying to develop products that stand in isolation to the market that they serve, for example, UPI was developed for a product, and many of the major players in the banking and finance sector were definitely interlocutors in the conversation that ultimately led to the incubation and development and the deployment of UPI. But those actors are probably still have not yet emerged in sectors like health or transport or in digital commerce in India, because there may be fledgling startups that are interested in the development or how they can contribute to the development of DPI or how they can plug and play DPI to serve their solutions. But many of those startups have just not been invested in at this moment or at a very early stage of incubation. Now the thinking appears to be, at least in sectors, especially in Bangalore and Delhi, that are thinking on DPI, is you think of a particular sector or a market as a playground. Who are the actors who are going to be involved in this playground, constantly engaging with the DPI, helping develop and improve the standards associated with this infrastructure, and ultimately delivering products that are user-facing? Think about this in a future-facing way. Try and conceptualize certain abstract categories of actors who are involved in the development of DPI and see whether you can develop certain first principles, some of which are technically coded into the DPI, some of which will have to be regulated by policy. So even if you can't see, even if you can't look, raise your eyes and see who are the actors in, for example, health or transport maybe today, can you visualize a certain category, abstract category of actors? For example, financial information users. When the DPI involving access to credit was developed in India, can you visualize a category of market actors that will be using your financial information to provide services to you? Some of those actors were already in the market. Some of them will establish themselves in the near or even medium term future. So can you develop those categories of actors? And can you develop a DPI around and rules of engagement for DPI around those abstract categories of actors? And here, the thinking seems to be that each playground should have three categories of institutions. So there may be different, a wide variety of market players, but there should be in each playground where DPI is being developed, there should be three categories of institutions. One, the regulator. Now, the regulator can be a public regulator in the sense that it's a state-run institution that is actively determining the parameters by which users and market players engage with DPI. You may have a different sectoral regulator for privacy and a different sectoral regulator for anti-competitive practices. But that's ultimately depending on the design of the DPI. That's one category of institution. The second category of institutions would be self-regulating entities that would provide a foot in the door for market actors to determine the daily operational practices of how DPI is being introduced in the market. For example, what are the lending limits? What is the volume of transaction that is acceptable? What do you do if things go wrong in terms of cybersecurity? What do you do in case fraud is detected, and so on and so forth? What are the rules that should be developed by actors with respect to I would say, for example, in sectors like insurance, what are the fiduciary practices that should be developed by market players in this specific sector? The third category, and perhaps I should have started with that, the third category of institutions is the TSO, the Technology Standard Setting Organization. Ultimately, DPI is a technical product, so you have to have some kind of an institution that develops the technical standard for the product. Now, this can be, the TSO can be a multi-stakeholder institution. It can be a private institution. And here is where the, I should say the lessons from different jurisdictions are actively feeding into a debate in India. We are seeing that standard setting bodies, if we were to go by the example of the IETF, that has a different standard setting mechanism than, say, how China develops technical standards for digital infrastructure or technical standards for privacy and cybersecurity. So there's an active debate going on all three rungs of all three categories of institutions. But I think there's an especially robust debate going on among developers of DPI as to what is the best way to craft a standard setting body in a way that is inclusive, that is not easily cannibalized by first movers, which may often be big tech companies, given that they have simply the resources to fly their developers to any part of the world or any part of the country and be an active proponent in responding to policy debates. But also in a way that ensures accountability to the user. And it's a very complicated and a complex debate, but one one way of thinking about the playground, as it were, seems to be to categorize each playground into first abstract categories of actors who are likely to populate it in the near and the distant future, but also have these three somewhat immutable categories of institutions that ultimately determine what are the rules of the road for how DPI engages with the market and with the user.
So, Arun, like when you talk about the market play and what's a playground, there has been a certain level of criticism in terms of like how the playground has got created and things, and especially in light of criticism from enterprises like Visa and MasterCard as well. So how do you really look at this space? Because suddenly there is a government-owned, government-created infrastructure which suddenly supersedes any of the what I call entities that could have been fairly important in the market.
Right. No, I think that's a very legitimate question. And I should say with this, giant disclosure that I have been an active volunteer for one of the bodies that were involved in the standard setting organization as a standard setting organization for some of this infrastructure, which, as you may know, a body called iSpirit, which is largely comprising developers, but also involves policy professionals, those with legal expertise like me who want to contribute to the shaping of this DPI ecosystem. There are, much like the experience that we have with DPI itself, there have been positive and negative lessons that we've learned about the operation of standard setting bodies. And some of it sort of compares with the lessons that global bodies like ISO or IETF or the IEEE have learned over the course of a much longer period of time as well. The first is that a volunteer-driven model for a TSO, where in some respects, this resembles the IETF model, where you have a number of technically accomplished individuals from all walks of life, but more importantly, from companies that are likely to have a skin in the game, come together and create a group that ultimately coalesces and formalizes into a standard setting body. That's one experience. But for that ideal standard setting body to be realized over the course of many years, you need to have market players. You need to have a clear sense of how how rules regarding the development of standard setting work, and certain operational concerns like where are you going to meet? Are you going to meet in Bangalore? Are you going to meet in Bombay? Are you going to meet remotely? Certain bread and butter considerations that need to be addressed, for which we are not there yet. So the thinking in iSpirit at that time, and I'm talking, say, 2-3 years ago, which probably is, I'm not so engaged at the moment, but I would imagine is the thinking even now, is you need to have a volunteer-driven group that is primarily supported institutionally, much like how iSpirit supports its volunteers. It recruits volunteers, it tries to recruit those individuals from various disciplines who are mission-oriented, who like to contribute to the development of a DPI in a particular sector, drawing on their own experience, and is ultimately given what is called a living wage by iSpirit, because in many cases, this will be the development of this technical standard for a DPI will be the only thing that he or she is doing for periods as long as 3 or 4 years. And this is at a minimum. How are you going to be able to institutionally support volunteers who want to contribute towards nation building, but at the same time don't have a clear timeline of how this is going to be achieved and when this is going to be achieved, or for that matter, how this is going to be achieved? The way it worked, at least in the first generation digital public infrastructure in India, is that there would be a body like iSpirit where you would have volunteers helping develop a standard such as UPI, which is nothing more than an application programming interface for this particular sector. Develop it in consultation with the key private actors in the space and the regulator. Of this, there is no doubt, which was definitely the experience with UPI as well. But ultimately, hand it over to the regulator. And this is perhaps the most sensitive and tricky phase of standard setting. the handing over of the standard that you have now developed and which you full know might become the de jure market standard if you hand it over to the regulator, because you are ultimately the only standard setter in town. So if we used to joke that there should be let 1,000 ice spirits bloom, but the fact is that this thus far into the journey, there has not been a lot of competition for the technical standard setting bodies themselves. Now today we have actually 2 or 3 major standard setting bodies. You have both iSpirit and Beacon in Bangalore, different private entities that are working towards developing standards for different DPI in various sectors. But at least in the beginning, the concern is if you do develop this standard, and it may be an imperfect product as most standards are in their first generation, and you hand it over to the regulator, especially if the regulator is the state, or even worse, if the regulator also has a skin in the game, as is the case in many economies, not just India, where the RBI is also a player, but also the regulator for that matter, then it's a very sensitive a thing that you have to navigate. Oh, is this standard going to be the de facto and de jure standard for the DPI? And does that mean once we've handed it over to the state, do we still get some agency over improving this technical standards for efficiency, for security, for all the reasons that technical standards are improved over time? And if the answer is that if you've handed this over to the state and the doors are suddenly closed on you, then what incentives do TSOs have in continuing to develop these standards? So this is an ongoing and frankly difficult dialogue that happens between TSOs and Indian government agencies. But this is an experience I think both sides are living and improving, hopefully.
If I can jump into this, I think that one of the issues is that technology standard setting bodies tend to reflect established players. And they are the ones who have the financial resources to devote staff to this whole process. And sometimes they slow things down.
Yeah.
There was quite a concern that the time it takes to reach a standard in telecom is something like 6 or 7 years, which is way too late for the people who are out developing not only technologies, but applications that are already, ready to use some sort of an infrastructure. How do you keep the process from being distorted? And how do you, because you really want to maintain a robust kind of entrepreneurial startup sector to this, as well as deal with the problems at a quality level that the established players can deal with. How do you keep up? How do you keep it moving fast?
Yeah, I mean, now you're asking the really tough questions. I think it's tough. And if anything, Richard, as you know, the experience of even the IETFs and the IEEEs of the world show that they're extremely susceptible to the market priorities and plans that the leaders in a particular sector have with respect to developing and deploying a product at scale. And sometimes that results in geopolitical backlash, even as you know, with the experience of Huawei in 5G, right? I think Indian bodies are not even close to scratching the surface of this question. I think what we have tried to do, wearing my hat as an iSpirit volunteer from a few years back, what we tried to do at that point was to, one, ensure that there are certain technical principles that are hard-coded with respect to the sharing of consent to protect the user, and we can go into the details of that. So that certain aspects of privacy and data protection are embedded, are hard-coded into the technical infrastructure that underpins the DPI. But with respect to the development of the standard itself, can you develop rules of engagement that ensures that anybody can raise questions regarding the efficacy of a standard and propose a conversation on whether the standard should be improved or not. Now, this is very much an academic debate at this point, because I think from a larger national perspective, there are two things that the Indian government is trying to juggle with respect to DPI. One, it wants for the citizenry to trust a particular DPI that is developed by a standard setting body that is ultimately, of which the government is the owner, or in a better scenario, is the steward or the custodian. One, it wants for the citizenry to trust the standard, trust that it delivers a reasonable degree of security and privacy or data protection from the use of this standard. Second, it wants to scale up the use of that standard. So technical standards will have to figure out as to whether there are trade-offs involved between privacy and use of adoption and all of those concerns. The government may say that this is my policy priority, and it may ask the standard setter to develop a DPI that responds to those policy priorities, which involves a series of compromises. And the standard setter may say, but there is a cybersecurity question here. We'll develop this product for you as long as we can get to the cybersecurity question at a later stage. The question, therefore, is, can the standard setting body reach that iteratively develop a better cybersecurity standard for the DPI at a later stage, or is it walled off by the government? And
can I throw this back to you for? Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, can I throw this back to you for a case study? So you talked about in the development of Unified Payment Interface that the National Payment Corporation of India cooperated with the private sector banks or worked alongside with them in order to develop this standard. What could be learned from that specific example?
With the NPCI example, so the NPCI essentially has 10 core promoters. You have the Reserve Bank of India, which is the federal bank, but you also have major banks that have supported the development of the standard. Somebody who is involved in the development of the UPI standard would tell you that there were long and difficult conversations that were had with the market players in this space, ultimately arriving at some level of consensus that the UPI standard, as it were, is a good first generation standard to sort of implement at scale, and we will essentially make the NPCI the steward or the custodian of that standard. So this is the first generation of the UPI standard and its governance. Then the question comes, is UPI going to provide a sustainable source of revenue for the actors in this market? That's not a technical question, but that's a policy question. Now, the standard setters who are involved in the development of UPI may have had some thoughts about it, but NPI too had some thoughts about it, and so did the government of India, which was not really willing for Indian users to be charged on the development, on the use of UPI, because that would be political harakiri at such an early stage. So there were three contrasting priorities there. That conversation, as you know, Richard, is still ongoing, and we still do not have any answers on whether the government will promote, or the RBI, I should say, will promote a merchant discount rate or will implement an MDR for UPI. The second sort of elephant in the room, as it were, was the RBI, being a regulator, was also actively playing a role as the preeminent interlocutor in the development of the standard. So did you need to have the regulator involved in the development of the standard at a very early stage? This is a question that is going to be answered differently by different countries. For example, the United States might approach this very differently than Kenya, than India. And this ultimately depends on the role of the central bank, the legitimacy that is conferred upon the central bank in a country, as you know, I had mentioned, low trust, high trust. And the RBI enjoys incredible legitimacy in the eyes of the Indian user. So it actually served to the benefit of the ecosystem that the RBI was also a player in the development of the standard, but it being also a regulator, what are the conflict of interest questions that have arisen in this space? This question too has also not been answered, because, once the regulator is in the room, are you really going to have a difficult conversation saying, oh, maybe the regulator should come in at the stage once the standard has been developed and improved, and then the regulator can, make all sorts of policy choices. So this is another conversation that, that hasn't been answered. And the final discussion is about data protection and cybersecurity, a conversation that has, to put it mildly, that has not been at the forefront of these discussions around the development of DPI, but are now increasingly getting a lot of attention these days because of course, the high rate of cybercrime in a country that is booming like India, but also, various instances of geopolitically motivated state-sponsored actors that are trying to take down financial payment gateways, health infrastructure, transport infrastructure of various countries, including India. This is a policy priority that belongs to a different agency of the the government, which is the National Cybersecurity Coordinator's Office. Of course, the RBI is concerned with the cybersecurity of financial gateways, but you also need other actors in the room who have more visibility on some of the larger national considerations with respect to data protection and cybersecurity. You would need a regulator for data protection, which we still do not have, to contribute to the development of the technical standards, at least in the preliminary stage or in the policy consultation stage. And that would hopefully that would contribute to the development of UPI in its third generation. But these conversations tend to be somewhat abstract, simply because in some cases there are some institutions that are absent, and in some cases the players that should lead these conversations are absent. But I'm largely optimistic that we are getting there, because the sectors are getting populated, however slowly.
Well, and one of the things that seems clear from the India example is that there is sort of a shared consensus of what the people need, that this is taking priority over the more narrowly defined interests of a particular company or even the regulatory institution. And
Absolutely.
That is maybe something that accounts for what to me looks like pretty amazing success so far. I'm
Absolutely.
really curious how this can be a model, or how it can be applied to the rest of, especially emerging economies, developing economies, the global South, whatever you would call it. And are there going to be increasing issues with the integration of India's DPI with that of the rest of the world?
Right. And I think this is really the most sort of this is what I'm most optimistic about. I think despite all the challenges associated with DPI development in India, and some of it, as we have just discussed, we've really been talking about the operational nuts and bolts in a very granular way about the development of this infrastructure. But it's also important to realize that this conversation is being had in an open way. To put it very bluntly, if China were developing DPI, we would not get insights or visibility into the development of such infrastructure in the same way that it is being discussed in India. So what this means is that the process of DPI development and deployment will be slow, because there will be conversations that are happening back and forth between various regulators and various players in the market. There will be inefficient choices that are made. But as you rightly and very elegantly said, Richard, there is no doubt today in the policy choice that the Indian government has made to make this a pillar of economic development going forward. It is today an article of faith that the development of digital public infrastructure for a sector that is considered critical to nation building, for example, health, transport, finance, can be done through DPI. And that's really, shifting the Overton window in terms of discussion. There is no debate today that there may be a debate today as to the quality of a particular digital public infrastructure, as to whether it really plugs efficiency gaps, whether it addresses leakage, whether it protects cybersecurity or data protection. But there is no debate today in the normative choice that India has made with respect to the adoption of digital public infrastructure. And that's a huge development for a country like India, which has been slow in policy making over the last 70 years. But it's a huge moment for other countries as well. To take, let's leave aside the global South for a moment. Let's talk about the United States. Today, the United States is coming to terms with the development of interoperable public infrastructure like FedNow for the payment gateway, but it's unable to reconcile in many respects with the presence of established giants in, for example, the finance sector or the health sector, with the objective of developing application programming interfaces for sectors such as health, transportation, or finance. In India, the good and bad thing is that the economy or certain sectors of the economy in which DPI is being considered have not matured. So there is not only the absence of fossilized regulations, but there's also no fossilized thinking about some of these issues. And once you have brought all stakeholders to the point where you say, okay, DPI is perhaps useful in addressing the gaps that have plagued the sector for so long, then it's easy to convince other countries that you can adapt it depending on the political economy that you have. For example, it would be difficult to convince the United States to adopt something like UPI, but it would be easy to co-opt the United States into a larger geopolitical, geo-economic effort, diplomatic effort to say, can we be partners together in developing digital public infrastructure for other economies, depending on how their sectors work, depending on what their conditions are, because we now know what are the problems associated with the development of the standard and the implementation of that standard. And the United States brings in geo-economic clout and certain normative leadership qualities as the sort of preeminent power in the liberal international order. And India brings with it, of course, the experience of developing digital infrastructure, which is continuously evolving, but also confidence in a third party, in a third state, whether it's in the developing country, the developing world, or the developed world. This confidence that we have made a choice as a country that we will go the path of digital public infrastructure to solve our most critical issues. And I think that's a huge development.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Over to you, Amit.
Yeah. So, as we were talking about like what's happening and how the global work or how globe is looking at it. But my biggest question is going to be that how are people reacting or other countries reacting, or what are the multilateral concerns around this whole idea when India is trying to push this infrastructure? Because you of course say like China would behave in a certain way, US is behaving in a certain way, but I'm sure there are certain concerns that do emerge out of this as well.
Right. And I think this debate is happening both at the national level and at the international level. Countries like Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Philippines, all countries that have requested help from India or have, based on their own experiences with developing, for example, the digital identity platform, as is the case with MOSIP in the Philippines, they have expressed interest in being an active interlocutor with India and other countries in developing such DPI for the world. They are all having these two-level debates. They are having debates nationally as to whether this is a good or a bad thing. There is also a multilateral debate that's happening at the G20, at various UN fora, as you pointed out. I think, and as you may know, there is also the UN Digital Public Goods Alliance, which essentially is a repository of efforts, both multi-stakeholder, but also government-led efforts to incubate such digital standards in various sectors, test them, evaluate evaluate the technical standard for various concerns such as security, privacy, etc., and then put it out on the repository and make it, easy for governments to adapt them for their respective economies. So there is a technical conversation going, which I'm not fully qualified to speak to, which and therefore I won't. But I definitely would like to sort of weigh in on the larger geopolitical diplomatic debate that is going on in this space. There are three sort of mainstream approaches to digital infrastructure generally, sort of digressing briefly from the DPI debate at the moment. And they pertain broadly to a market-led development pioneered by the United States, a state-led development of technical infrastructure and standards that has been pioneered by China, and if you want to call it a third approach, a sort of a policy-led approach that has been pioneered by the United States. We just finished a conversation at Leiden with Anu Bradford, who has written this book called Digital Empires, and she says that these three empires are coexisting and colliding at the same time. Mm-hmm. The challenge with these three empires or these three models of digital governance is that there is no multilateral framework that can adapt the best of the lot. These three countries, or these three regions of the world, are simultaneously engaged in a contest to ensure that their models of digital governance are also adopted by different countries. And this, and this is being seen in debates on the TPP, RCEP, various digital agreements, plurilateral agreements that are floating around. This is where India sort of comes in with its experience on digital public infrastructure. I don't think India is making any broad political, normative, or economic claims beyond the fact that DPI is going to contribute to your nation building. India is not making any larger political or normative claims as to the adoption of DPI. India is not claiming, to the best of my knowledge, India is not claiming that DPI is going to make society more open or transparent, that it will fundamentally rearrange the social contract between the state and the citizenry. India is simply saying, here is a technical product that comes with certain policy configurations, some of which we messed up, and we would therefore like to help you understand how we messed up and what we did right. And this is a product that you can use as the building infrastructure for the next generation of evolution for your critical sectors. And this is a very appealing message, I feel, to different economies that are frankly exhausted by the geopolitical tensions and the technology Cold War that is playing out between the United States and China. This does not mean that India does not have any geopolitical ambitions. I think, as with any democratic government, India too, democratic society, India too would like to see it being a leading player in this space. But I don't think the DPI messaging is being confused with the larger debates on digital governance. And for this reason, I feel countries will be more open and willing to engage with India on this issue, and hopefully result in more fruitful collaborations.
No, this is just fascinating, Arun. Richard, do you have any question before we close?
No, I think not. I think this is kind of a good stopping point. There's a lot to think about this morning. And Arun, I want to thank you so much for sharing your candid views and a lot of information that is really meaningful. The third way, right? Neither market-driven nor state-driven, but policy-driven. Interesting.
Thank you, Arun, for joining us. It's absolutely been a pleasure. Long time since we met. I think the last time we met was at your wedding, about half a decade back, if I'm not wrong. But then we should meet up in person, and I'm sure we will find a way to get you at Stanford. This has just been such a enlightening interaction, and look forward to being in touch. Arun, be well and take care. Thank you. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.